She did not lose her seat that night. She only watched another woman embarrass herself trying to take it. Grace Bennet arrived at the Harrington Opera House a little after 7, alone beneath a row of gold lamps that made the marble lobby glow like polished honey. Outside, black cars rolled up along Columbus Avenue, doors opening to silk gowns, tuxedos, pearl earrings, and the soft click of expensive shoes on stone. Inside, the air carried the scent of winter coats, white lilies, and old velvet, with the distant sound of violins tuning behind the closed auditorium doors. Grace wore a midnight blue evening dress with long sleeves and a quiet neckline, the kind of dress that did not ask the room for approval. Her hair was swept back loosely, her makeup soft, her face calm enough that no one would have guessed how carefully she had prepared herself to be unseen. This opera house had once felt like home to her. She knew the curve of the grand staircase, the brass rails warmed by 100 hands, the painted ceiling where tiny angels looked down through clouds of fading gold. She knew which usher kept peppermints in his pocket, which balcony light flickered before the second bell, and which box had belonged to her mother before the name Bennet meant anything to the people now whispering in designer coats. A young attendant in a black suit recognized her immediately and stepped forward with a respectful smile. "Mrs. Bennet, we have your box ready." Grace opened her mouth to thank him, but the lobby shifted before she could speak. Conversations thinned. Heads turned toward the entrance. Charles Whitmore walked in with Madison Vale on his arm, as if he had timed the moment to bruise quietly and be admired for it. Charles wore a black tuxedo, his silver cuff links catching the light, his expression smooth and practiced. Madison moved beside him in a pale champagne gown, smiling as though the building had been waiting for her. Her hand rested on his sleeve with the confidence of someone who had been promised a public victory. Grace felt the old ache rise, not sharp anymore, only familiar, like a song she had stopped singing but still knew by heart. Charles saw her. Of course he saw her. His eyes flicked from her dress to the attendant, then to the staircase that led toward the private boxes. Madison followed his glance and stopped. "Wait," she said, her voice bright enough to reach the donors standing near the coat check. "Why does she get the box?" The attendant froze with the program book still in his hand. Grace stood perfectly still. Charles did not correct Madison. He did not lower his voice. He did not say that Grace had every right to be there. He simply looked away for 1 second too long, and that 1 second did more damage than any speech could have done. Madison smiled wider, mistaking silence for permission. "I mean, if we are being honest, Charles, traditions change. Some seats should belong to the life people are actually living now." A woman near the staircase lowered her eyes. Someone coughed softly into a gloved hand. The lobby became a room full of people pretending not to witness humiliation while arranging their faces around it. Grace looked past Madison, past Charles, toward the velvet ropes and the small brass plaque mounted outside the box door above the main level. The engraved name caught the light with quiet certainty, Margaret Bennet. Her mother's name. Madison had not noticed it. Charles had. That was why he looked uncomfortable for the first time all evening. Grace did not argue. She did not explain. She only placed her hand lightly over the program book the attendant still held and said, with a voice as soft as the first note before an orchestra begins, "Please show us to the theater." Charles did not always know how to enter a room like the Harrington Opera House. Years before the marble lobby learned his name, before donors reached for his hand and society pages printed his photograph beside chandeliers, he had stood outside this same building in a rented black suit, looking at the ticket in his hand as if it were written in another language. Grace remembered the night clearly as the usher led them toward the stairway now, past the velvet ropes, past the curious faces, past Madison's smile that had begun to sharpen at the edges. Back then, Charles had been 32, ambitious, brilliant in the way hungry men often were, but painfully aware of every place that made him feel unfinished. He had asked Grace whether people would notice if he clapped at the wrong time. She had smiled and adjusted his collar in the reflection of the glass door. "Just listen," she had told him. "You do not have to prove you belong to something beautiful. You only have to respect it." That was the first lesson she gave him, though he would later pretend he had taught himself everything. Grace had grown up inside these sounds. Her mother, Margaret Bennet, believed music was not a luxury but a language, and she brought Grace to Saturday matinees when tickets were still printed on thick cream paper, and a small girl could lean over the balcony rail feeling as if the whole world had learned how to breathe in rhythm. Grace had watched singers cross the stage in velvet gowns, had counted the gold leaves painted along the ceiling, had sat beside her mother in the private box after Margaret began funding youth music programs quietly through family friends. To Grace, the opera was not about status. It was about silence becoming sound. It was about grief learning melody. It was about people stepping into darkness together and trusting beauty to find them. Charles had not understood that at first, but Grace had been patient. She explained the overture on the cab ride home. She showed him how to read the program notes, how to let the story unfold without checking his watch, how to speak to patrons without sounding like he was auditioning for importance. When his business grew, he began inviting clients here. Grace chose the seats, handled the donations, sent handwritten thank you notes, remembered which trustee preferred tea over coffee, and which soprano had once studied in Chicago. Charles received the admiration. Grace arranged the grace. Slowly, the place that had once humbled him became another stage where he performed success. He stopped asking what the music meant. He started asking who would be seated nearby. He stopped looking up at the ceiling with wonder. He looked around to see who was watching him look up. The change was not loud. It arrived in small corrections. He told Grace her dress was too simple for opening night. He said her fondness for old traditions made her seem sheltered. He laughed when she defended community music classes, saying wealthy patrons cared about prestige, not after-school violins in underfunded neighborhoods. She had answered him, then, with the same calm he mistook for weakness. Prestige fades when the lights come up, she said. What remains is what we helped someone hear for the first time. Now, climbing the carpeted stairs behind the usher, Grace heard Madison behind her whisper, "This is ridiculous. She is acting like the place belongs to her." Charles did not answer quickly enough to defend Grace, but not slowly enough to hide his discomfort. Grace reached the landing and paused beside the brass plaque outside the private box. Margaret Bennett's name shone under the wall sconce, steady and untouched. Charles saw it again, and for a moment, the borrowed confidence in his face looked exactly like the uncertainty of the man who had once asked Grace when to clap. The usher stood beside the private box with the careful patience of someone trained to survive wealthy discomfort, one gloved hand resting near the brass handle, the other holding 3 programs pressed neatly against his jacket. The corridor outside the balcony was narrow enough to make every silence feel intentional. Below them, the lobby continued to shimmer with late arrivals, but up here the air was quieter, lined with red carpet, framed portraits of past performers, and wall sconces that threw warm light across the old wood. Grace remained beside the plaque bearing her mother's name, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the program. She could feel Charles behind her, too close to pretend he was a stranger, too distant to feel like a husband. Madison stepped around him as if the corridor itself had been waiting for her opinion. She looked at the private box, then at Grace, then back at Charles with a soft laugh designed to sound charming from a distance. "Charles, this is awkward," she said. "You cannot seriously expect me to sit somewhere else while she sits in the box." The usher's eyes lowered. Charles adjusted one cuff link. The small silver movement buying him time he did not deserve. "Madison," he said, his voice smooth but thin, "this is opening night. Let us not make a scene." Grace almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, but because Charles had always believed a scene was something a woman made when she refused to accept humiliation quietly. Madison lifted her chin. "I am not making a scene. I am asking a reasonable question. If everyone already knows your marriage is over in every way that matters, why is she still being treated like the woman of the evening?" The words landed softly, because Madison was skilled at cruelty wrapped in perfume and manners. A couple passing on the staircase slowed just enough to hear. An older patron with a diamond brooch looked toward the floor. Grace felt heat rise along her neck, not from shame alone, but from the sudden memory of her mother's hand resting over hers in this same box years earlier, teaching her how to follow the translation lines, whispering that beauty should never make a person feel small. Charles gave a quiet, uncomfortable laugh and placed his hand near Madison's back without touching her in any dramatic way, just enough to show the corridor where his loyalty had moved. "Grace understands," he said. "She has always been graceful about these things." There it was, Her name turned into a duty. Grace looked at him then. Not sharply, not pleading, just steadily enough for him to remember every time her silence had protected him from looking cruel. Madison saw the look and stepped closer to the door, her gown brushing the red carpet. Some memories should not reserve seats forever, she said, especially when the present is standing right here. The usher swallowed. Charles did not correct her. That was the deepest insult, not Madison's demand, but the space he left open for it. Grace turned her gaze to the brass plaque again. The letters were clean, polished earlier that afternoon by someone who still knew what the name meant. Margaret Bennett. Beneath it, in smaller engraving, were the words in honor of music education and public access. Madison had missed those words completely. She only saw a box, a balcony, a symbol to claim. Grace saw Saturday afternoons with her mother, paper tickets tucked into a handbag, donated lesson books, children waiting outside practice rooms with borrowed violins, and hope too fragile to name. From below, the first bell rang through the opera house, low and elegant, asking guests to take their places. The sound moved through the corridor like a warning wrapped in velvet. Grace released the program from her hand and looked at Madison with a calm that made the younger woman's smile falter. You are right about one thing, Grace said. Some seats are not reserved by memory. Charles exhaled as if he expected surrender. Grace continued, her voice quiet enough that everyone had to listen more closely. They are reserved by what someone gave when no one was watching. Then she stepped aside, not to yield, but to let the usher open the door. Inside the box, the air held the quiet dignity of old velvet, polished wood, and flowers arranged in a silver vase near the rail. Grace stepped in first, not because she was fighting for the seat, but because the room seemed to recognize her before anyone else did. The small space opened toward the stage below, where the orchestra pit glowed with soft lamps and musicians turned pages with careful hands. For a moment, the noise from the corridor faded, and Grace saw another Winter, another version of herself, standing alone in a storage room behind the opera house with dust on her coat and a checkbook in her hand. It had been 8 months after Charles began arriving at public events with Madison. Society did not need a formal announcement to understand replacement. It learned from photographs, table placements, small omissions, and the way a husband no longer reached for his wife when cameras appeared. Grace stopped attending dinners where people asked questions with their smiles. She stopped correcting captions that called her a guest instead of a trustee. She stopped waiting for Charles to remember the woman who had taught him that elegance was not the same as ownership. But she did not stop coming to the opera house. She came on Tuesday mornings when the lobby was empty and the chandeliers were dim. She came in wool coats and flat shoes, carrying coffee from a shop 2 blocks away, walking through side doors instead of the grand entrance. That was how Eleanor Hart first saw the truth of her. Not the abandoned wife people whispered about, but the woman measuring broken practice room mirrors, asking about heating costs, reading old scholarship applications with her gloves still on because the office was too cold. The community music program was weeks from closing then. The youth chorus had lost its sponsor. The old rehearsal rooms needed repairs. The piano in Studio 3 had 3 keys that did not sing anymore. Children from the Bronx, Queens, Newark, and Upper Manhattan were going to lose the one place where their voices were treated like they mattered. Grace listened to Eleanor explain the numbers without interrupting. Then she asked for the full budget, the donor list, the teacher contracts, and the maintenance estimate. Eleanor apologized for the size of the problem. Grace only looked through the window at a hallway of empty music stands and said, "My mother believed a locked door teaches a child the wrong lesson." 3 weeks later, Grace sold the Vermont house Margaret Bennett had left her, a white farmhouse near a frozen lake where Grace had spent childhood summers learning the difference between loneliness and peace. Charles never asked why she let it go. He assumed, as he often did, that anything outside his attention had no meaning. Grace placed the money into the Margaret Bennett Arts Fund and asked that her own name remain quiet. She paid for the rehearsal rooms, restored the piano, kept the youth chorus alive, funded voice lessons, violin rentals, transportation stipends, and Saturday matinee seats for children who had never walked beneath a painted ceiling before. She wrote notes to teachers by hand. She sat in the back row during student recitals and left before applause could turn toward her. The work healed her in ways no apology could have. Every child who opened a score with nervous fingers returned something Charles had tried to take. Her belief that beauty belonged to those who gave, not those who claimed. Now, seated in the box bearing her mother's name, Grace watched Madison step in behind Charles and look around as if she had conquered something. Madison chose the front chair nearest the rail. Charles hesitated, his eyes moving again to the plaque outside the door, then to Grace. He was beginning to understand that the room was not merely reserved. It remembered. Eleanor Hart had spent 31 years learning how a theater tells the truth before a person does. It told the truth through empty seats no donor wanted to notice, through rehearsal rooms that smelled of old dust and cold radiators, through young singers who arrived with borrowed sheet music and left before asking whether they could come back next Saturday. As executive director of the Harrington Opera House, Eleanor knew every polished lie wealthy patrons told themselves. They loved music, they said, as long as music arrived dressed in velvet, framed by chandeliers, and seated far away from need. Grace Bennett had never spoken that way. She came without photographers, without assistants, without the hungry brightness of someone waiting to be thanked. The first time Eleanor found her in Studio 3, Grace was sitting on the piano bench with her coat still on, pressing one broken key again and again, listening to the thin silence where a note should have been. "This cannot stay like this," Grace had said. Not dramatically, not as a complaint, as a promise. From that morning on, Eleanor watched the Margaret Bennett Arts Fund become the quiet pulse beneath the building. New music stands appeared. The youth chorus kept its director. The cracked rehearsal mirrors were replaced. A transportation card program began for students coming from farther than 10 miles away. A girl from the Bronx received voice lessons after her teacher wrote that she sang like someone trying to open a locked window. A boy from Queens was given a rented cello, then a place in the student ensemble. Parents who had never stepped past the lobby were invited to watch their children rehearse under lights that had once belonged only to people who could afford beautiful things. Grace asked for no plaque beyond her mother's name, no speech, no social announcement. She only asked Eleanor to make sure the children never felt like guests in a building their music helped keep alive. Eleanor agreed then, but over the months, agreement became discomfort. Silence could be noble, but it could also become another room where a woman disappeared. The board felt it too. At the final planning meeting for opening night, Eleanor placed the dedication draft on the long walnut table and let everyone read it without speaking. It named Margaret Bennett first, then Grace Bennett, not as a wife, not as a former society figure, not as someone connected to Charles Whitmore, but as the founder and principal benefactor of the fund that had saved the public access program. One trustee asked whether Grace had approved being recognized. Eleanor looked toward the framed photograph of the original opera house on the wall and said, she approved the work. The institution must approve the truth. They prepared carefully. No scandal. No accusation. No humiliation dressed as justice. Only facts, gratitude, and the kind of public respect Grace had spent years giving others. Eleanor did know Charles would attend. His office had accepted 2 seats through a corporate sponsor, and his assistant had requested prominent visibility, in language Eleanor found familiar and empty. She also knew Madison Vale's name had been added later, not through the box office, but through Charles himself. Eleanor had not expected Madison to demand the Bennett box. She had not expected Charles to stand silently while Grace was made to look like an inconvenience outside a door bearing her mother's name. Now, from the side aisle near the orchestra level, Eleanor looked up toward that box. Madison sat forward at the rail as if the view had been earned by beauty alone. Charles stood behind her, one hand resting on the chair, his face composed but tight. Grace sat slightly back from the velvet edge, midnight blue against the warm wood, calm in the way deep water looks calm before the light reveals its depth. The second bell rang. Eleanor closed the leather folder in her hands. The dedication was no longer merely appropriate. It was necessary. The third bell had not yet rung when Charles stepped away from Madison and turned toward Grace with the careful expression of a man preparing to call selfishness concern. The box was dimmer now, lit only by small gold lamps along the velvet wall and the widening glow from the stage below. Madison sat at the rail, arranging her program across her lap, as if she were already the photograph society would remember the next morning. Grace sat one chair behind her, close enough to see the orchestra settling into stillness, far enough from the rail that no one could mistake her quiet for a performance. Charles moved beside her chair and lowered his voice. "Grace, I need you to be graceful tonight." The words were polished, reasonable, almost gentle. That was how Charles preferred his cruelty, dressed as manners and delivered under warm light. Grace looked up at him. For a moment, she saw the younger man outside this same theater years ago, nervous about clapping at the wrong time, grateful when she told him belonging did not have to be loud. That man had learned the shape of elegance from her hands and later used it to make her look out of place. Madison did not mean anything by it, he continued. She is new to all of this. Do not make her uncomfortable. Grace let the sentence settle between them. Below, a violinist lifted her instrument, then lowered it again, waiting. In the nearby boxes, patrons leaned into their seats, programs folding softly, perfume and old velvet mingling in the air. Charles glanced toward Madison, then back at Grace, impatience breaking through the smoothness. This evening matters. There will be donors here, board members, press. I cannot have tension in front of people who matter. Grace almost asked when she had stopped matching, but the question felt too small for the truth standing around them. Instead, she looked past him to the brass plaque outside the door, barely visible from where she sat, but present all the same. Margaret Bennett. Her mother's name had watched the entire scene without needing to defend itself. Madison turned slightly from the rail, smiling over one shoulder. I only think everyone would be more comfortable if we accepted reality, she said. A woman can have history with a place without still belonging in the center of it. Charles did not stop her. He only looked at Grace, waiting for surrender to arrive in the familiar shape of her silence. Grace placed her program on the small side table beside a white floral arrangement. Her fingers were steady. She could feel the old wound. Yes, but it no longer directed her. It was simply a scar beneath evening silk, part of her, not the whole of her. You want me to protect your image, she said softly. Charles exhaled as if relieved she understood. I want you to avoid unnecessary embarrassment. Grace stood then, slowly enough that Madison's smile thinned. The movement was not dramatic, but the box seemed to hold its breath around it. Below, the conductor entered the pit, and the audience began its welcoming applause. Grace looked at Charles, then toward the stage where Eleanor Hart stood waiting in the side aisle with a closed leather folder pressed against her chest. Their eyes met for one brief second across the warm darkness. Eleanor did not nod. She did not need to. Grace turned back to Charles. I have been graceful long enough, she said. The applause faded. The house lights lowered. The conductor stepped onto his platform, lifted his baton, and for the first time that evening, Charles looked as though he had entered a room where Grace knew the ending and he did not. The conductor held his baton above the orchestra, and the entire opera house leaned toward the first note. From the main floor to the highest balcony, programs stilled in laps. Diamonds caught the last thread of gold light, and hundreds of strangers became one breath in the dark. Grace remained standing inside the Margaret Bennett box, one hand resting on the velvet rail, her midnight blue dress almost blending into the shadows behind the lamps. Charles stood beside her with a stiffness he tried to disguise as composure. Madison sat forward in the front chair, her chin lifted, her profile arranged for the audience below, still convinced that visibility and importance were the same thing. Then the impossible happened. The conductor did not begin the overture. He lowered the baton. A soft confusion moved through the orchestra pit. A violinist glanced toward the stage manager. A cellist adjusted his posture. Somewhere below, a man cleared his throat and then seemed embarrassed by the sound. Madison turned slightly, annoyed, as though the delay had personally inconvenienced her. Charles frowned. Grace did not move. She saw Eleanor Hart step from the side aisle onto the edge of the stage, dressed in black satin, a closed leather folder in one hand and a microphone in the other. The white stage light found Eleanor before the audience fully understood she was there. Her presence changed the room immediately, not with drama, but with authority. People who had been whispering stopped. The conductor stepped aside with respectful precision. Behind Eleanor, the red velvet curtain remained closed, heavy and silent, like a secret waiting for permission to breathe. Eleanor looked first across the orchestra level, then up through the boxes, not searching, but arriving. Her eyes reached the Bennett box and settled briefly on Grace. Madison followed that gaze and smiled, expecting, perhaps, that Eleanor was acknowledging the glamorous woman seated at the rail beside Charles Whitmore. But Eleanor's expression did not soften for Madison. It passed over her like light over glass and rested on the woman standing quietly behind her. Charles noticed. His hand tightened around the back of the chair. Eleanor lifted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice rich, clear, and carefully measured. "Before tonight's performance begins, the Harrington Opera House has a promise to keep." The audience shifted, drawn in by the unusual phrase. Grace felt the velvet rail beneath her fingers, the worn softness of it, the same place her mother's hand had once rested. Eleanor opened the leather folder. "For generations, this house has asked people to believe that beauty belongs behind expensive doors. But the true purpose of art is not to keep people out. It is to teach them that they were worthy of entering all along." A few heads turned toward the youth chorus seated in the side section near the front, children in dark formal clothes, sitting straighter as Eleanor spoke. Madison's smile faded by one careful inch. Charles looked from Eleanor to Grace, then toward the brass plaque outside the box as if the engraved name had become louder than the microphone. Eleanor continued. "This year, a program many of you know was scheduled to close. The children's chorus, the public access lessons, the student instrument fund, and the Saturday matinee seats were all nearly gone. They remained alive because one woman chose to give quietly, consistently, and without asking this institution to place her name above the work." The room grew still in a new way. Not polite stillness. Recognition approaching. Madison sat back slowly. Charles's face lost its public ease. Grace lowered her eyes for a moment, not from shame, but because the words were reaching places in her heart she had trained herself not to expose. Eleanor turned a page in the folder. "Tonight's performance will begin differently because gratitude should not wait until the final curtain." The stage lights brightened, and above the closed curtain, a projection appeared. The restored rehearsal room, the youth chorus, a polished piano in Studio 3, and the brass plaque outside the box bearing Margaret Bennett's name. The audience inhaled almost as one. Eleanor looked up toward Grace, and this time the entire opera house followed her gaze. Eleanor let the silence stretch just long enough for every guest to understand that the evening had left the path they expected. Above the closed curtain, the projection changed again. The restored rehearsal room appeared in clear warm light, no longer cold, no longer forgotten. Then came a photograph of children standing beside music stands, a young girl holding a violin almost too large for her arm, a boy seated at the repaired piano in Studio 3, his fingers hovering above the keys with the solemn hope of someone touching a future for the first time. Beneath the images were simple lines of recognition, not flashy, not sentimental, just dates, programs, and the name of the fund that had made them possible, Margaret Bennett Arts Fund. Madison stared at the screen as if the words had rearranged the air inside the box. Her hand slipped. From the velvet rail, the seat she had demanded suddenly looked less like a prize and more like evidence. Charles did not look at Madison. He looked at the projection, then at Grace, and something careful in his face began to come apart. He had known about the box. He had known about Margaret Bennett. But he had not known the full scale of what Grace had done while he was busy being admired in rooms that still did not know who had truly paid to keep the music alive. Eleanor lifted the microphone again. "Tonight's opening performance is dedicated to the late Margaret Bennett, whose belief in public access began this legacy, and to her daughter, Grace Bennett, whose quiet generosity kept it alive when this house nearly failed the children it promised to serve." The words moved through the opera house like a curtain rising inside every chest. For a moment, no one clapped. The room was too stunned, too busy understanding the cruelty of what had just happened upstairs and the grace of the woman who had endured it without correcting anyone. Then the youth chorus stood first. One by one, the children rose from the side section near the stage, their dark formal clothes neat, their eyes lifted toward the box. Their applause began softly, uncertain at first, then stronger. Parents joined them, then trustees, then patrons from the orchestra level, then the balconies, the boxes, the entire opera house. The sound rose in waves, not polite, not automatic, but deeply human. Grace stood frozen inside the Bennett box, one hand near her heart, the other lightly touching the rail her mother had once touched. She had not wanted the room to turn toward her. She had not given for this. But when she looked down and saw the children clapping, the old ache inside her changed shape. It was no longer humiliation. It was release. Madison remained seated in the front chair, her face drained of its practiced brightness. The champagne-colored gown, the perfect posture, the public claim beside Charles. All of it suddenly seemed thin beneath the weight of what she had tried to take. Charles finally stepped closer to Grace, his voice low and uneven. "Grace, I did not know." She did not answer. Immediately, the applause surrounded them, filling the box, the corridor, the theater, the space where his excuses might have lived. Grace turned to him only long enough for him to see that his ignorance was not innocence. Then Eleanor spoke again from the stage. "Ms. Bennett, if you are willing, this house would be honored to welcome you to the stage." The spotlight shifted upward, finding Grace in midnight blue beside the brass plaque of her mother's name. Charles stood half in shadow. Madison looked away, and Grace, after years of being asked to step aside, stepped forward. Grace stepped out of the Bennett box while the applause was still rising, leaving Charles and Madison behind in the half-light, like figures from a story that no longer had the power to follow her. The corridor outside the box felt longer than before, but not heavier. The red carpet beneath her feet, the brass sconces along the wall, the framed portraits of singers who had once filled the building with impossible sound, all seemed to lean toward her in quiet recognition. The usher stood near the doorway with shining eyes, and when Grace passed him, he placed one hand over his heart without saying a word. She descended the staircase slowly, not because she wanted the attention, but because she no longer needed to rush through places where other people had tried to make her feel unwelcome. Below, guests turned in their seats to watch her cross the aisle. Some of them had once smiled at Madison across dinner tables while pretending not to notice Grace's absence. Some had accepted Charles's version of elegance because it was easier than asking who had taught it to him. Now they stood as she passed, their applause following her like a tide. Grace did not look up at the box again. Charles remained there, one hand on the velvet rail, his face pale beneath the warm lamp. Caught between pride he could no longer claim and regret he had no right to display. Madison had stepped back from the front chair, her champagne gown dimmed by shadow, her gaze lowered toward the program in her lap, as if the paper could offer a place to hide. On stage, Eleanor waited with a bouquet of white roses and lilies, the same flowers Margaret Bennett had once ordered for youth recitals when the children were too nervous to believe the applause was for them. When Grace reached the stage, Eleanor did not make a spectacle of embracing her. She simply held out the flowers with both hands and bowed her head. "Ms. Bennett," she said into the microphone, "this house is grateful." Grace accepted the bouquet. The stems were cool against her palm. For one moment, she thought of her mother seated beside her in the old box, whispering translations, saving ticket stubs, believing that beauty should be opened like a door instead of guarded like a jewel. Then Grace looked toward the youth chorus. Their faces were bright under the side lights, nervous and proud, and still clapping as if they understood more than anyone else what had been returned. Grace stepped to the microphone. The applause softened into a silence so full it felt alive. "My mother used to say that a seat in a beautiful room means very little unless someone is willing to hold the door open behind them," she said. Her voice was steady, but warm at the edges. "I did not give to this house so my name could be spoken. I gave because somewhere in this city, there is a child who has been told that opera is too expensive, too distant, too refined, too far above their life. I wanted that child to walk in, sit down, and hear the world become larger." A soft sound moved through the audience, the sound of people recognizing truth without being forced to applaud it yet. Grace glanced once toward the box, not at Charles, not at Madison, but at the brass plaque outside the door bearing Margaret Bennett's name. "Some places remember love better than people do," she said. "Tonight, I am grateful this one remembered." The applause returned, deeper than before, and the conductor lifted his baton again. Grace stepped away from the microphone, not as a discarded wife, not as a woman competing for a seat, but as the quiet reason the music could begin. The curtain rose behind her. The first note filled the house, and Charles, standing in the box he had tried to let another woman claim, finally understood that Grace had not come back to take her place. The place had always been hers.